Bleach, Can't Fear Your Own World by Tite Kubo and Ryogo Narita. Volume 1. Seek not aesthetics in war, seek not virtue in death. Think not of thy own life. Should thee seek to protect thy king and the 5 dukes, slay all foe as indifferently as shadows of the leaves. From the Shinoi Jutsuin Academy Handbook, Soul Reaper Regulations Encyclopedia, excerpted from the older edition. Don't seek aesthetics in battle. Don't seek virtue in death. Don't believe your life only belongs to yourself. If you really want to protect something, attack the enemy from behind. From the Shinori Jutsuin Academy Handbook, Soul Reaper Regulations Encyclopedia, excerpted from the new edition. Prologue. First part. Once a great war raged between the gods who claimed to preside over death and those who destroyed the souls of the wicked. After 1,000 years of discord, the conflict came to an end when the kings of both sides were brought down. And this great loss became the opportunity to usher in a new dawn for the relationship between Soul Reapers and Quincies. But few knew the real truth, that a single person had been responsible for killing both kings, one who was neither Soul Reaper nor Quincy. The rebels who invaded the Soul Society were known as the Vandenreich, or the Invisible Empire. Their leader was defeated by a boy who served as a deputy Soul Reaper in the 13 Court Guard companies. That scant bit of knowledge, along with the declaration that the 13 Court Guard companies protected the Soul King, was the only information to be disseminated across the Soul Society. In other words, news that the Soul King, the very foundation of Soul Society, had died was withheld to prevent the spread of panic. Residents of the Soul Society, including rank-and-file Soul Reapers, still believed that the Soul King was enshrined in the Reikyu, the royal palace. The knowledge of his death was limited to specific Soul Reaper captains, a few higher-ranked seats, and those who held important posts in the Seireitei, all of whom were not especially anxious to destroy the general peace by exposing the truth. And so restoration of the Seireitei began. Whether the upper echelons of the Soul Society had made the right decision when they chose not to rob the people of their emotional anchor would be determined in the decades and the centuries to come. That last battle later came to be known as the Great Soul King Protection War. Our story traces back to a time immediately after the end of that conflict. The Reo Greater Palace, Inner Sanctuary. There were royal guards bustling busily in the spot where the Reo, the Soul King, had once been enshrined. High Priest Ichibei Hyosobe, part of Squad Zero and also the commander of the royal guards, silently gazed at the thing in the center of the palace and stroked his black beard. An airy voice called out behind him, "Is that the new Reo, your eminence?" Hyosobe turned to see a man standing there whose right eye was covered by a patch. It was Shunsui Kyoraku. "Ah, looks like you're up and about again, Kyoraku. I suppose you wouldn't be the Captain General of the 13 Court Guard companies if you weren't." Hyosobe replied with a lively smile. He realized that Kyoraku's gaze was directed not at him, but at the center of the area, where the royal guards were at work. He replied to Kyoraku's earlier question. "You should already know that the concepts of old and new don't apply to the Reo. There's simply value in having something here to revere and call Reo." "So basically you're saying power's all in the name." Looking conflicted, Kyoraku continued in a politer tone. "In the worst case scenario, Ichigo would have been sealed to that name." Good thing he wasn't, Yosobe, his voice free of emotion, offhandedly all but confirmed that there really had been a chance that Ichigo might have been named the Reo. Then, teeth bared in a smile, Yosobe continued to speak of Ichigo Kurosaki. That young lad caught my interest too, and I would have been quite beside myself if he had been rendered silent. And good thing, too. I wouldn't want Ichigo's friends hating me. Ah, yes. You gave them soul tickets, didn't you? Let's make sure to keep that a secret from Central 46 and the aristocrats. Good grief, nothing slips past you, your eminence. The Rayo's throne was a far from desirable seat, and Kyoraku thought being installed there would have been one of the worst possible endings for Ichigo Kurosaki. He looked at the thing in front of him, and the memories etched in his mind flashed once again. In preparation for that worst case scenario, Kyoraku had given special spiritual tools called soul tickets to those in the world of the living who knew Ichigo Kurosaki. Soul tickets were talismans that allowed one to move freely between the mortal world and the Soul Society, and were the practical result of improvements to earlier techniques that had been used to transfer still living humans from Karakura Town to the Soul Society. Kyoraku quietly closed his eyes and remembered warning Ichigo Kurosaki's friends. Depending on the type of power it is, it may affect the world of the living. If that's the case, we can't allow him to come back here. He recalled the boy who had at first joked around, but had then looked intensely angry when Kyoraku explained that it was no joke. You're not joking? Yeah, you're telling us to really say goodbye like that? Then Kyoraku recalled the boy with black hair, whose reaction had been the opposite of the first, and who had been immediately angry on Ichigo's behalf. His serene eyes had held an intense belief in Ichigo, and it never wavered. Then there had been the girl who had been more concerned for Ichigo's family than herself, and who had been deeply distressed on Ichigo's behalf. Ichigo's blessed when it comes to friends. Well, I suppose he attracts people like Saro and Orihime because he's Ichigo. Thinking about the children from the world of the living, Kyoraku was relieved that Ichigo Kurosaki was safe now after being the main player in the war's end. Then Kyoraku opened his eyes slightly and spoke to the high priest, an odd statement slipping from his mouth. More importantly, I'm glad you and the others didn't kill Ichigo. The high priest neither denied nor confirmed as he laughed heartily and slapped his own bald head. Well, I'm no Yuaba after all. I can't see into the future. No, in actuality, Ichigo Kurosaki couldn't have won against him. If anything, we needed him to lose. But luckily for the boy, Yuaba had all of the Ryu's power. That guaranteed that the Soul Society would escape destruction whether or not Ichigo Kurosaki won. The high priest faced the thing at the center of the greater palace and clapped his hands together while he spoke. At the clear sound of the clap, the high priest closed his eyes and prayed. Kyoraku continued his attempt to question him. High Priest Yosabe, is that the will of the Reo? Or is it just the will of the founders of the 5 noble clans? Kyoraku, whose polite tone had slipped, received an easygoing reply from the high priest. My, how can you speak so disparagingly of our dignified founders? Your tone hides none of your animosity. Do you think so little of Byakuya Yakuchiki and Yoroichi Shihoin? They've given me no reason to. They're fellow members of the 13 Court Guard companies, and I consider them dear friends. Smiling wryly, Kyoraku shook his head as he continued, tone still casual. They aren't responsible for the actions of their ancestors, and it's not as if they pretend their ancestors are faultless. Isn't that right, High Priest Yosabe? I suppose you could say that. And none of the founders of the 5 great noble clans are still alive anyway. Just as the high priest spoke, an explosion echoed through the greater palace. Huh? Kyoraku turned towards the source of the sound, feeling a spiritual pressure markedly different from that of a soul reaper. A section of wall that had been until moments ago fused with the Vandenreich building had been destroyed. White smoke was rising from the rubble. Several humanoid figures, whiter by far than the smoke, appeared beyond the wall. The Greater Palace Royal Guard immediately unsheathed and readied their swords, but the high priest commanded them to hold. "Oh, no need to worry. Everything's fine. You can't win against these ones anyway." One of the pale silhouettes had already leapt towards them and clucked his tongue as though taken aback. "What? You're not gonna fight me?" Grimjaw Jaggerjacks, who brought to mind a wild beast, glared at High Priest and Kyoraku with sharp eyes as he landed. "I'm not standing down just because you put away your swords." Grimjaw's hand went to his zanpakuto, but a small bala hit him in the back of the head. Gah! The impact was like being punched in the head. When Grimjaw turned to face his attacker, Neliel to Olospank was standing there, left hand still aimed at him. The ram-horned Arankar woman had arrived in the Soul Society with him, and was most likely the one who had hit him with the bala. "Neliel, why you?" "Is this really the time to pick a fight? Now that the Quincy King's gone, we're the largest group of outsiders in the Soul Society." "What about it? If you're scared, take that dead weight of yours and go back to the Garganta." The dead weight was an Arankar woman currently leaning on Neliel's left shoulder. She was Tyr Haribel, and both she and Neliel wore the mask of the Tercera Espada on their bodies. Haribel had been on the front lines from the moment that the Vandenreich had launched a surprise attack on Hueco Mundo, but Yuhaba's overwhelming power had immobilized her, and she had been taken prisoner as a symbol of Hueco Mundo's defeat. When the Ryukyu had been recreated, Yuhabaha had thrown her into his own dungeons, and she had eventually come to the palace as a prisoner. Now that Yuhabaha was gone, no one knew whether he had kept her as a captive, as an example to the other Arankars, or in order to remold her into a vanguard for the Quincies. The only certainty was that she was still alive, and she had been freed when Neliel, Ichigo Kurosaki, and the rest of his gang had gone to see her. Though Neliel had rescued Haribel, the new king of Hueco Mundo, she had mixed feelings about the current situation. They had been Aizen's followers, and they had first come to the Ryukyu to stand before him here, where he had so longed to be. Even as she dealt with her own uncertainty, Neliel asked Grimjow, who was hostile towards the Soul Reapers, "You're going to pick a fight with the people who've already been worn down by Quincies? That's the kind of fight you like?" "You're so naive. You think these Soul Reapers will actually turn a blind eye to us? I'm not going to let them stab us in the back on our way out." The good-natured, bald old man sporting a black beard answered him. "Oh, I'll always look the other way when it comes to you. I would even be happy to escort you all the way back to Hueco Mundo." "Here you. You're really underestimating us." The wounded Arankars were no threat, and Grimjow assumed that was what the high priest meant. A murderous urge radiated from his whole body as he glared at the bald old man. "The opposite! The opposite! You're much, much more powerful than any old hollow. If we carelessly purify or eradicate you the way things currently stand, the balance between the three worlds would collapse." Grimjow was briefly silent, but soon tisked as though reaching some internal understanding, and held back his animosity. He probably preferred to settle things with Ichigo Kurosaki as soon as possible rather than waste time fooling around here. Neliel guessed his priorities, and considered springing a surprise attack on him at the right moment in order to shut him up so she could drag him back to Hueco Mundo. But Haribel, who was barring her shoulder, suddenly spoke up. "Is that what you're calling the Rayo?" Her words were a whisper, almost as though she were speaking to herself. Her gaze was focused beyond the Soul Reapers at the thing enshrined at the center of the palace. "Is that the foundation of the Soul Society?" So, Miss Arankar, do you object to it too?" the bald man asked while stroking his beard. Haribel slowly shook her head. "I'm just a defeated soldier right now. I have no right to comment. But I understand why our late king hated that thing." Haribel removed herself from Neliel's shoulders and turned her back on the Soul Reapers. "We've caused trouble for you. We will repay our debt." "Oh, no worries. The best way for you to repay us is by staying in Hueco Mundo and not causing any more problems. And if you're going to thank anyone, you should thank Ichigo Kurosaki." Kyotoku said as he started to escort the Iran cars out. The woman turned to leave the palace. Grimjaw had interrupted Haribel's comment about debt differently. All right. I need to repay that Kurosaki guy. You want to finish things with Ichigo while he's still wounded? Neliel accused. The two continued bickering and squabbling as they left, just as they had been when they arrived. Ah, well, everyone seems to want a piece of Ichigo. Kyotoku noticed that the high priest, who had been standing next to him, was headed out of the greater palace. Where are you going, your eminence? Just going to give Squad Zero a wake-up call. Squad Zero, the 5 members, including the high priest, were said to be as powerful as the entire 13 court guard companies put together. They were the elite special royal guard. Each member of Squad Zero was a pioneer who had developed something fundamental to Soul Reaper operations, such as Zanpakuto or Shihakusho. They were paragons who had fittingly nurtured Soul Reaper history from its starting point of 0. But Kyotoku had heard that Yuaba and his subordinates had killed all of Squad Zero, minus the High Priest, before he made his way to the palace, and so the phrase wake-up call left him puzzled. The High Priest immediately offered an answer to his confusion. We didn't convert our bones to oaken for the fun of it. Our spiritual powers have more or less fused with the spiritual pulse flowing from our Zero Raiden. As long as one of us survives, the others will revive enough to at least walk when they are called for. So you would have been in quite a dire situation if Ichigo hadn't won, your eminence. Yuabaha had at one point remade the Ryukyu into the Warwelt, the castle of the true world. Had Yuabaha now been alive and well, even the vestiges of the Ryukyu would have vanished and the entire Squad Zero, minus the High Priest, would have perished. Squad Zero won't die so easily. I won't allow it. That's their fate. And I need Oetsu and the others to get back to work. The High Priest had spoken in an aloof manner, just as Kyotoku normally did, but he paused for a moment to stroke his beard several times while looking up at the sky above the palace. That whippersnapper has been up to no good while we have been fighting. Phoenix Palace, half an hour later. Oh, this has got me beat. Oetsu Numaya had just been brought back from the edge of life and death by the high priest Yosabe. He was holding his head slumped at the bottom of an ocean even deeper than the subterranean level of the Phoenix Palace, or at least he was where the ocean would normally have extended across his Zero Raiden. Through the lenses of his glasses, he observed a demolished iron door and the wreckage of sacred ropes and shredded fabric cords. A very specific Zanpakuto was usually sealed away behind that door, but the seal had been ruthlessly destroyed, and there was no sign of said Zanpakuto anywhere. Taking in the destruction from where she stood next to Oetsu, Mara Hyuchigashima, a Zanpakuto and part of Numaya's elite guard, heaved a long sigh. This is what happens when you let yourself get beat without thinking it through, sir. Seriously. Normally, the sword storehouse rested far from the reach deep below the ocean waves, but making Ichigo Kurosaki Zanpakuto had caused massive evaporation, exposing a significant stretch of the seabed. I know, it was an emergency. But this stitch went in sideways in all the wrong ways, Oetsu said, looking around as he righted his glasses. Toki Tonokawa and Nanomi Nomino, also part of Oetsu's guard, were tending to the numerous injured men collapsed all around who had been guarding the sword storehouse. That bone-dry ocean was like an open invite to walk right in. Plus, me and Sayapushi were out. Oetsu narrowed his eyes, the quiet rage shimmering in them a far different emotion than what had shone forth when he had faced Yuaba. But what really gets me is that some sleabag looter showed up during a bona fide Soul Society emergency. There was something odd about the wounds the Zanpakuto had suffered. These were among the strongest of the humanized Zanpakuto, and yet areas of their body had been frozen, and some were burned, or were twitching as though they had been electrocuted. while others seemed to have been poisoned or riddled with holes. A few of their limbs even seemed to have been crushed by blunt weapons. Mera tisked at the many unique wounds, each distinctive to a different Zanpakuto. Seriously? How many people were involved here? If they had that many fighters, they could have at least pitched in during the war. One of the Zanpakuto who had regained consciousness shook his head at Mera's words. It wasn't. Hey, are you alright? It wasn't what? It was just one person. The surprise attack? It was all one person. Mera was even more bewildered at the other Zanpakuto's words. That wasn't possible. Not with all of the varied wounds they had. Oetsu's reaction, however, was entirely different. He narrowed his eyes behind his tinted glasses and spread his hands wide, nodding as though convinced of something. I see. Well, yep, I get it, so that's how it is. You're weirding me out in a whole lot of ways. So could you just stop talking to yourself, sir? That's harsh, Mera. Well, that heart-to-heart just helped me pin down the culprit. Oetsu remained in silent thought as he plucked a shred of binding cloth from the scraps that littered the ground. The cloth looked as if it had been bitten through, and it brought to mind a very specific person. I wouldn't let a nobody handle one of my swords, but Iko Mikidomoe isn't a sword that can be handled by a nobody in the first place. As he muttered the name of the missing Zanpakuto, Oetsu looked into the empty air with the heartache and outrage of an offended swordsmith, but also with a good deal of wariness. So, who are you going to get to wield that sword for you, Aristo? Then, just as the great battle ended, the Ryoku's borders were once again sealed. The deadened air resonated with the echoes of combat and the unchanging authority opposed by the Ryo, and a great many warnings signaling disaster remained in the atmosphere, or rather countless sens continuously suggesting the dawn of a new age in the Soul Society drifted among the pronounced reishi.